Part 1. The studio sat cold and bright under humming lights that never turned off. 4 walls of glass and steel holding air that smelled like coffee gone stale and cables left too long in the sun. A mixing board stretched across one wall, its buttons glowing soft blue, waiting for hands that did not yet know what to do. This was not a place for magic, it was a place for work. And today the work was simple. A man sat in the tall black chair, his arms folded tight across his chest. He had been here since morning, watching the clock more than the musicians. His job was to make sure the music fit the time slot, the budget, the brand. He did not come here for beauty, he came for results. Across from him 3 people waited on a worn leather couch, their instruments resting beside them like old friends who had seen better days. They had played together for 2 years, not because they dreamed of fame but because the music felt true when they were in the same room. Now the room felt heavy. The man in the chair finally spoke, his voice flat like pavement after rain. "They want 30 seconds," he said. "Just a simple melody, something soft, something forgettable. It is for a commercial about toothpaste. People will hear it while brushing their teeth, they will not even notice it is there. That is the goal. Do not make it interesting, do not make it stick in the mind. Make it disappear." The guitarist nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of his instrument case. The drummer stared at the floor, his foot tapping once then stopping as if remembering he was not supposed to feel anything. The third person, the one who played piano, said nothing. She had joined the group only months ago, quiet, careful, always arriving early to test the keys of whatever piano waited in whatever room they played. She did not talk much, but when she played the others leaned in without meaning to. Now she stood and walked across the studio to the far corner where an old upright piano lived. It was not part of the expensive equipment, it was just there, a piece of furniture with yellowed keys and a scratch down its side. The studio owner called it character, but everyone else called it broken. Still she sat on the bench, adjusted her weight and let her hands hover above the keys. No one watched closely. The man in the chair checked his phone. The guitarist tuned a string that did not need tuning. The drummer counted tiles on the ceiling. They expected 30 seconds of nothing. They expected to leave soon and forget this day. Her fingers touched the keys. First one note alone, hanging in the air like a single drop of water falling into a still pond. Then another rising just enough to make the ear lean forward. Then a third, not higher but softer, as if the note itself was shy. She did not play a song, she played a feeling. 3 notes up, 1 note down, a small space of silence, then a resolution so gentle it felt like coming home after a long trip. The melody lasted 12 seconds, when it ended the room did not feel the same. The man in the chair had stopped looking at his phone, his hand frozen halfway to his pocket. The guitarist had forgotten his tuning peg, his head tilted slightly as if listening for something behind the wall. The drummer was not counting tiles anymore, he was staring at the piano, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that matched nothing in the room. No one moved. The air itself seemed thicker, not with sound but with something else, something that had been missing. The studio had always been a place of business, a place of deadlines and revisions. But for those 12 seconds it became a place of breath. The kind of breath you take when you see something beautiful and do not want to ruin it with words. The kind of breath that holds time still for just a moment. She lifted her hands from the keys. The last note faded, not with a bang but with a sigh, as if the piano itself was reluctant to let go. The man in the chair stood slowly, his chair making a soft sound against the floor. He walked not toward the mixing board but toward the window that looked out over the city. Towers of glass and steel reached for a sky the color of wet cement. Cars moved like ants along ribbons of road. People hurried everywhere with nowhere to be. He placed his palm against the cool glass and stood there, his back to the room. The guitarist finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was that?" She looked at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. "I do not know," she said. "It just came." The drummer stood and walked to the piano, not to play but to stand beside it. He placed one hand on its side, feeling the wood warm from her touch. He did not say anything, he just stood there, his shoulders less tight than they had been all morning. Minutes passed, not in seconds but in breaths. The clock on the wall ticked but no one heard it. The man at the window turned slowly, his face not angry, not pleased, but changed, somehow softer around the edges, like stone worn smooth by river water. "Play it again," he said. She looked up surprised. "But you said simple, you said forgettable." He shook his head once, a small motion that held a world of meaning. "I was wrong." She turned back to the keys. This time she played the melody slower, stretching the spaces between notes like pulling taffy. The second note hung in the air longer, the pause before the resolution felt like a question. And when the final note arrived, it did not answer the question, it simply made the question feel okay to hold. The guitarist picked up his instrument, not to play over her but to listen closer. He sat on the floor, cross-legged, his back against the wall, his eyes closed. The drummer remained standing, one hand still on the piano, his other hand resting at his side. The man left the window and stood behind the mixing board, but he did not touch any buttons, he just listened. This was not what they had come here to do. They had come to make background noise for people brushing their teeth. They had come to fill 30 seconds with sound that would be ignored. But what filled the room now was not background noise. It was presence. The melody ended again. This time the silence that followed was not empty, it was full. Full of what had been said without words. Full of what had been felt without touch. Full of the strange truth that sometimes the smallest things carry the most weight. The man walked to the center of the room and sat on the floor, not in his expensive chair but on the hard surface beside the others. He looked at each of them not as employees or contractors but as people who had just shared something rare. "That melody," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "That was not for toothpaste." No one disagreed. She looked at her hands again, then at the piano, then at the faces around her. "I can make it simpler," she offered. "I can take away the space between the notes, I can make it straight and clean." "Do not," he said. "Do not change a single thing." Outside the studio the world continued as it always had. Cars moved, people hurried, deadlines waited. But inside these four walls something had shifted. The air felt different, the light seemed warmer, the space between people felt smaller, not because they were closer together but because the walls around their hearts had thinned just enough to let something pass through. She played the melody a third time. This time the drummer found a rhythm, not with sticks but with his fingers tapping softly on the piano's wooden side. A heartbeat beneath the notes. The guitarist hummed along, not loud, not trying to be heard, just adding his breath to the sound. They were not making a commercial anymore. They were not even making music in the way they usually thought of it. They were sharing a moment, a fragile thing that could break if handled too roughly. So they handled it gently. When the last note faded this time no one moved right away. They let the silence sit among them like a guest who had just told a beautiful story. The man finally stood and walked to the mixing board. He pressed one button, a red light glowed. "We are recording," he said. "Play it again." She smiled, a small smile that reached her eyes. And she began. The melody rose into the room once more, simple, soft, true. And the room, which had been cold and bright and businesslike moments before, now held something it had not held all morning. It held wonder. Not the loud kind of wonder that shouts and demands attention. But the quiet kind that slips in through a crack under the door and changes everything without making a sound. This was the kind of wonder that asks nothing in return. It only asks that you notice it. And for 12 seconds in a studio that smelled like stale coffee, 4 people noticed. They did not know then that this moment would change more than just the afternoon. They did not know that weeks later they would gather again in a different room with a different piano just to feel this feeling once more. They did not know that the man would keep the recording labeled only with the date and room number, treating it like a secret too precious to share. They only knew that for these seconds the world outside did not matter. Only the notes mattered. Only the space between them mattered. Only the truth that sometimes the simplest things carry the deepest weight. She played the melody one last time before the hour ended. And when it finished, the room state changed. Not because of magic or mystery, but because four people had allowed themselves to feel something together. And that is always enough to change a room completely. Part 2. The red light on the mixing board glowed like a small steady heart. The room held its breath. She placed her hands on the keys again, but this time something had shifted inside her too. Before she had played without thinking, just letting her fingers find what they needed to say. Now she played with intention, not to impress, not to prove anything, but to give the melody room to breathe. The notes came slower this time. Each one given space to live before the next arrived. The first note hung in the air like morning light through a window. The second rose gently, not demanding attention, just asking to be noticed. The third lingered at the top of the phrase as if remembering something important. Then the fall, not a drop but a soft landing, like a hand placed on a shoulder. The resolution arrived not with certainty but with kindness. Behind the board the man watched the sound waves bloom across his screen. Green lines rising and falling like hills in the distance. He did not touch any knobs, he did not adjust any levels. He simply let the microphone drink the sound. His eyes stayed on the piano, not on the screen. He was not capturing audio anymore, he was witnessing something. The drummer moved first. He walked to a small stool in the corner and sat facing the pianist, not to play yet but to be closer to the source. His hands rested on his knees, palms up as if ready to catch something falling from the sky. The guitarist stayed on the floor but shifted his weight forward, his instrument still in its case. He closed his eyes and let the sound move through him like water through stone, carving channels he did not know existed. The melody ended. The silence that followed was different this time. It was not empty, it was full, waiting. The man at the board spoke, his voice softer than before. Again he said, "But do not think about it, just let it come." She nodded and began once more. This time the drummer joined. Not with sticks, not with force. He used his fingertips on the wooden side of the piano, a soft tap 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 that sat beneath the melody like roots beneath a tree. The rhythm was not strict, it breathed with the notes sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, like a heartbeat during a dream. The pianist did not look at him, she did not need to. Their timing found each other without words, without signals. It was as if the melody itself had created a space where they could meet. The guitarist opened his eyes. He watched the drummer's hands moving with such care, such attention. He watched the pianist's shoulders rising and falling with each phrase. He watched the man at the board who had stopped being a producer and had become simply a person listening. Something warm spread through his chest, not excitement, not joy, but recognition. This was why he had started playing music years ago in a small room with a second-hand instrument. Not for crowds, not for money, but for moments like this when sound made strangers feel like family. He reached for his guitar. He did not plug it in, he did not tune it perfectly. He simply held it against his body and let his fingers find three notes that lived underneath the piano melody. Low notes that did not compete but supported. Like a foundation for a house, the melody was building in the air. The man at the board finally moved his hands. He turned one knob slightly to let the guitar enter the recording. He adjusted another to balance the soft percussion of fingertips on wood. He worked not as an engineer but as a gardener tending to something alive. He did not shape the sound, he simply gave it room to grow. The melody played through once more, all four people now connected not by plan but by presence. No one led, no one followed. They moved together like birds changing direction in flight, without a signal, without a leader. The music was not theirs, it belonged to the room itself. They were just the ones lucky enough to be there when it arrived. When the final note faded, the man pressed a button and the red light went dark. For a long moment no one spoke. No one moved to check phones or look at clocks. They simply sat in the afterglow of what had happened. The drummer was the first to break the silence. He did not use words. He placed his hands together and bowed his head slightly toward the pianist. A small gesture, but it carried everything he could not say. The guitarist nodded once, slow and deep. He looked at the man at the board, expecting to see business return to his face, expecting the spell to break. But the man's expression had not changed. If anything, it had softened further, as if layers had been peeled away during those minutes of music. That was not 30 seconds, the man said. That was 3 minutes. No one had noticed the time passing. 3 minutes could be nothing in a studio session filled with false starts and technical problems. But these 3 minutes had felt like both a second and a lifetime. They had entered the room as workers with a task. They were leaving as something else, though none of them had words for it yet. The man walked from behind the board and stood in the center of the room. He looked at each of them not as hired musicians but as people who had shared something rare. "I cannot use this for the commercial," he said. "The client wants something forgettable. This is the opposite of forgettable." The guitarist started to speak, but the man held up a hand gently. "Do not misunderstand," he said. "This is not a rejection. This is a protection. Some things are too precious to sell. I will give them something else, something that fits their needs. But this stays here with us." He walked to a small shelf and took down a notebook. He opened it to a fresh page and wrote in careful letters, "Room 4B317 in the afternoon." Then he looked at the pianist. "Will you play it one more time?" he asked. "Not for the recording. Just for us." She smiled, a small true smile that reached her eyes. She turned back to the keys. This time there was no pressure, no expectation. No thought of commercials or clients or deadlines. There was only the room and the people in it and the melody that had found them. She played. And as the notes filled the space, something remarkable happened. The man who had arrived all sharp edges and business talk sat cross-legged on the floor, his back against the wall, his eyes closed. The drummer rested his head against the piano, his breathing slow and even. The guitarist held his instrument like a child holds a favorite blanket, not to play but for comfort. And the pianist played not for them, not for herself, but for the moment itself. The melody rose and fell 3 times. Each repetition slightly different, not because she changed it but because the room had changed. The air carried the memory of the previous playing. The walls held the vibration of what had come before. The people in the room carried the feeling in their bodies. When it ended, the sun had shifted outside the window. Golden light now poured through the glass, painting the floor in warm stripes. The studio no longer felt cold or sterile. It felt like a sanctuary, a place where something true had been allowed to happen. The man stood slowly, his joints cracking softly. He walked to the window and looked out at the city again. But this time he did not see a landscape of commerce and hurry. He saw rooftops where people lived, kitchens where meals were made, windows behind which lives unfolded. He saw not a market but a collection of human hearts. And for the first time in years he felt connected to them. "Thank you," he said without turning around. The words were simple but they carried the weight of the afternoon. The pianist closed the piano lid gently. She did not speak, she did not need to. The others gathered their things slowly, not rushing, not eager to leave. They moved with care as if the room itself had become fragile precious. At the door the guitarist paused. He looked back at the piano, at the mixing board, at the patch of golden light on the floor. He felt a pull to stay longer, to sit in the silence a while more. But he also felt something else, a quiet certainty that this was not an ending. This was a beginning. The drummer clapped him lightly on the shoulder. They walked out together into the hallway where the world waited with its noise and demands. But something had changed inside them. They carried the melody with them, not in their ears but in their chests. A small steady rhythm they could return to when things grew loud or complicated. The man stayed behind after the others left. He sat in his tall black chair and played back the recording once. He listened not as a producer judging quality but as a person receiving a gift. When it ended he saved the file with the name he had written in his notebook. Then he closed his eyes and let the memory of the live playing fill him one more time. He knew he would return to business tomorrow. Contracts would need signing, deadlines would press in, clients would make demands. But he also knew something had shifted inside him, something that could not be undone. He had spent years believing music was a product, something to be shaped and sold. Today he had remembered it was a language, something that could heal without trying to. Outside the studio the city continued its endless motion. Cars flowed, people hurried, lights blinked on as afternoon gave way to evening. But in one small room on the fourth floor a simple melody had done what simple things sometimes do. It had reminded four people that beneath all the roles and responsibilities and routines they were human beings capable of connection, capable of wonder, capable of creating beauty simply by being present together. The room sat empty now, but it was not the same empty as before. It held the echo of what had happened. And echoes have a way of returning when called. The man stood and turned off the lights. He locked the door behind him. But he knew he would be back. Not for a session, not for work. But to sit in that room again and remember how a few simple notes had changed everything. He walked down the hallway toward the elevator. His steps were lighter than when he had arrived. His shoulders carried less weight. He did not know what would come next. He only knew that afternoon had given him something he had not known he needed. A reminder that the simplest things often hold the deepest truth. And that sometimes all it takes is 12 seconds of honest sound to change a room completely. Part 3. Days passed like pages turning in a book no one was reading carefully. The city moved on with its usual rhythm, traffic flowing, conversations overlapping, deadlines met and missed. The studio on the fourth floor sat empty most hours, waiting for the next session, the next client, the next transaction. But something lingered in that space, a feeling, a memory held in the walls themselves. The man returned to his office the next morning. He wore the same clothes, the same watch, the same expression he always wore for meetings. But inside something had shifted. He sat at his desk surrounded by screens showing charts and schedules and budgets. His assistant brought coffee and contracts to sign. He performed his duties with precision, but his mind kept drifting back to 12 seconds of sound. He found himself listening differently to the music sent by other artists. Not judging it for marketability or trend alignment, but asking a new question. Does this feel true? He did not tell anyone about the session. He did not share the recording labeled Room 4B317. It lived on his private drive, a secret he protected without knowing why. Sometimes during difficult meetings, when voices rose and tensions built, he would close his eyes for a moment. And in his mind he would hear the three ascending notes, the gentle fall, the soft resolution. His breathing would slow, his shoulders would drop an inch. The melody became an anchor, a small quiet place he could visit without leaving his chair. The guitarist went home to his small apartment above a bakery. The smell of bread dough rose through his floorboards each morning, a comfort he had stopped noticing months ago. That evening he sat on his couch with his instrument across his lap. He did not play songs he knew, he did not practice scales. He simply let his fingers find notes that felt close to what had happened in the studio. Not the same melody but the feeling behind it. Space between notes, room to breathe, warmth without force. His neighbor knocked on the wall, not in complaint but curiosity. The guitarist opened his door to find an older woman holding 2 mugs of tea. "I heard you playing," she said. "It sounded like rain on a roof. Can I listen for a moment?" He nodded and she sat on his worn rug while he played, not for her but beside her. When he finished she did not applaud, she simply smiled and said thank you. Then she left her mug on his table and returned to her own apartment. He realized he had not spoken to his neighbors in over a year. The next day he bought an extra loaf of bread from the bakery below and left it at her door. Small connections began to grow like moss on stone, quiet, persistent. The drummer spent his week teaching lessons to children in a community center. He had always focused on technique, speed, precision. But after the studio session he found himself pausing during lessons. "Watch how the silence lives between the beats," he told a young student struggling with a simple rhythm. "The music is not just the noise you make, it is also the space you leave." The child tried again, this time playing slower, leaving room between strikes. The rhythm transformed from mechanical to alive. The child's face lit up with discovery. The drummer felt something warm spread through his chest. He had spent years teaching music as a skill. Now he remembered it was also a language of feeling. The pianist did not return to the studio. She took long walks through parks, watching how light moved through leaves, how people sat together on benches without speaking yet connected. She visited small cafes and listened to the hum of conversation, the clink of cups, the rhythm of ordinary life. She noticed beauty she had been too busy to see before. An old man feeding pigeons, his hands moving with gentle certainty. A child laughing at bubbles floating through air. Rain beginning to fall on pavement, creating patterns that vanished as quickly as they formed. She carried a small notebook and wrote not words but shapes, lines that represented feelings she could not name. The melody from the studio lived inside her, not as a song to repeat but as a lens through which she saw the world differently. One afternoon she found herself standing outside a music school she had walked past 100 times without entering. Today she pushed the door open. Inside, children practiced scales on violins and flutes, their sounds overlapping in chaotic harmony. A teacher saw her lingering and approached. "Can I help you?" "I do not know," she answered honestly. "I used to think music was about getting the notes right. Now I wonder if it is about something else." The teacher, a woman with silver in her hair and kindness in her posture, nodded slowly. "Come," she said. "Sit with me." They sat on a bench in the hallway, listening to the sounds flowing from open classroom doors. The teacher did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "Music is not in the notes, it is in the space between them. It is not in the performance, it is in the listening. You have already learned this. You just needed to remember." The pianist felt tears rise, not from sadness but from recognition. She had spent years practicing perfect technique, flawless execution. She had believed mastery meant control. But the simple melody that changed a room had not been about control. It had been about surrender. Letting the notes find their own way, letting the silence speak, letting the moment be what it needed to be. That evening she sat at her own small keyboard at home. She did not try to recreate the studio melody. Instead she played what the day had given her. The sound of rain on glass, the rhythm of footsteps on pavement, the warmth of a stranger's smile. The music that came out was different each time but carried the same quality, the same breath, the same truth. Meanwhile the man made a decision he could not explain to his business partners. He declined 3 commercial projects that would have brought significant income. When asked why, he simply said they did not feel right. His partners exchanged worried glances, but he did not waver. He began seeking artists not for their social media numbers or streaming statistics but for something harder to measure. He listened for honesty in their sound, for space in their arrangements, for moments where technique stepped aside and feeling stepped forward. He received a demo from a young singer who recorded songs in her bedroom with a single microphone. The production was rough, the vocals sometimes shaky, but in the bridge of one song she left 4 full seconds of silence before returning with a single clear note. That silence held more emotion than many polished choruses. The man signed her without a second thought. His partners questioned the decision, but the recording later touched thousands of listeners who wrote letters saying it helped them feel less alone. The guitarist started playing on street corners on weekends, not for money but for the exchange. He would set up his case, open it not to collect coins but to create an invitation. People would stop, some for seconds, some for minutes. An elderly couple once danced slowly on the sidewalk to a melody he made up on the spot. A young father held his sleeping child close while listening, tears streaming down his face without embarrassment. The guitarist realized music was not meant to be consumed like a product. It was meant to be shared like bread broken between friends. The drummer began a weekly gathering in the community center after hours. He invited anyone who wanted to make sound, not just musicians but people who had never touched an instrument. They used buckets, wooden spoons, their hands on tables. He taught them one thing only: listen to each other. Do not play over one another, play with one another. The first sessions were chaotic, messy, loud. But slowly a rhythm emerged, not perfect, not polished, but alive. People who had felt invisible during the week felt seen in that room. They did not become musicians, but they became participants in something beautiful. The pianist received a letter one day, no return address, just her name on the front. Inside a single sheet of paper held 3 words written in careful script. Thank you for listening. She did not know who sent it, but she felt its truth in her bones. She framed the note and hung it above her keyboard. Weeks after the studio session, the 4 of them had not seen each other. They moved through their lives, changed but not yet aware how deeply. They carried the melody like a seed carried in soil, waiting for rain. They did not know they were all being drawn toward the same moment. They did not know the room had not finished with them yet. One evening the man found himself walking past the studio building long after business hours. A light glowed on the 4th floor. Curious, he took the elevator up. The door stood slightly open. Inside, the room was empty except for the old upright piano bathed in moonlight through the window. On the bench rested a single white gardenia, its petals soft in the silver light. No note, no explanation, just the flower resting where someone had sat weeks before and made magic. He did not touch the flower. He simply stood in the doorway and let the memory wash over him. He understood then that what happened in this room was not finished. It was not a single event but a beginning. The melody had not just changed that afternoon, it had planted something that was still growing. He left the door open when he departed. He did not lock it behind him. He walked into the night carrying the image of the gardenia, the memory of 12 seconds of sound, the certainty that some circles are meant to close. Somewhere across the city the guitarist tuned his strings. Somewhere the drummer tapped a rhythm on his kitchen table. Somewhere the pianist let her fingers rest on silent keys, waiting. The room waited too. Not empty but full of potential. Like soil after rain. Like a breath held before a song begins. Like the space between heartbeats where everything is possible. And in that waiting the simple melody lived on. Not as a recording, not as a memory, but as a promise. The promise that beauty arrives when we stop trying to create it. The promise that connection happens when we stop performing for each other. The promise that sometimes the smallest offering, a few notes, a moment of attention, a space held open, changes everything. The city slept around them, millions of people dreaming their separate dreams. But 4 hearts beat with the same quiet rhythm. A rhythm born in a cold studio on an ordinary afternoon. A rhythm that said you are not alone. A rhythm that said listen. A rhythm that said this matters. And it did. Part 4. The gardenia remained on the piano bench for 3 days. No one removed it, no one claimed it. The studio manager found it when opening the building each morning. He would pause, look at the white flower resting in moonlight, then sunlight, then moonlight again. He did not throw it away. Something in him knew this was not ordinary. On the 4th morning the petals began to curl at the edges, soft brown touching the white. Still he left it. That afternoon the man returned. He had not planned to come, he had been walking nearby, taking a route he never used. His feet carried him to the building without conscious decision. He rode the elevator to the 4th floor. The studio door stood open again. Inside, the gardenia waited, its beauty fading but still present. He walked to the piano and touched one petal gently. Then he sat on the bench where she had sat weeks before. His hands rested on the keys, not to play but to feel the wood beneath his fingers. He closed his eyes and remembered the 12 seconds that changed everything. Outside the window, dusk began to settle over the city. Lights blinked on in buildings one by one like stars arriving early. He did not move. He simply sat, breathing slowly, letting the room hold him. After 20 minutes he stood and walked to the mixing board. He powered it on, not to record but to listen. He pressed play on the file labeled Room 4B317. The melody filled the space again, 3 notes rising, 1 falling, resolution soft as breath. He let it play 3 times without moving. When it ended the room felt different, not empty but waiting. He made a decision then, not with his mind but with his hands. He picked up his phone and typed a single message to 3 people. The message contained only an address and a time: tomorrow evening 7 o'clock. No explanation, no request, no promise. Just the location of a small practice space on the edge of the city, a place with worn floors and a piano that stayed in tune most days. He sent it and turned off his phone. He left the studio without looking back. The gardenia remained on the bench, its work complete. The guitarist received the message while fixing a loose string on his instrument. He read the address and felt a pull in his chest, not excitement, not anxiety, but recognition. He knew where this was leading. He did not reply, he simply nodded to himself and set aside his phone. He spent the evening not practicing, not preparing, but simply being present in his apartment. He watered plants he had forgotten for weeks. He called his sister, a conversation he had been avoiding for months. He listened more than he spoke. When he hung up he felt lighter. The melody lived in him, not as a tune to remember but as a way of moving through the world. Slow, open, aware. The drummer received the message between lessons at the community center. Children laughed in the next room, their rhythms messy, joyful, alive. He read the words on his screen and smiled a small, true smile. He finished his lesson early, telling the children, today we listen more than we play. They sat in a circle and closed their eyes. He tapped one soft rhythm on a bucket, 3 notes up, 1 down, a gentle resolution. The children listened and tried to recreate not the notes but the feeling behind them. Their attempts were imperfect, beautiful, human. When they left he sat alone in the empty room. He did not wonder what tomorrow would bring. He only knew he would be there. The pianist received the message while walking through a park. She had been watching ducks move across a pond, their patterns seemingly random but somehow harmonious. She read the address and felt her breath catch, not from fear but from rightness. This was not a coincidence, she understood. The gardenia, the message, the pull she had felt all week, these were threads weaving together. She did not question them. She simply turned her steps toward home to prepare not her music but herself. She took a long bath, she cooked a simple meal, she sat by her window as darkness fell. She did not practice the melody. She let it rest inside her like a seed waiting for rain. The next evening they arrived at the practice space separately. The man came first, unlocking the door with a key he had borrowed. The room was small, with walls painted a soft blue that had faded in patches. A piano sat center stage, not grand, not perfect, but cared for. Chairs were arranged in a loose circle around it. He had brought nothing, no equipment, no expectations. Only himself. The guitarist arrived next, carrying his instrument in its worn case. He nodded to the man, no words needed. He placed his case against the wall and sat on the floor, leaning his back against the piano legs. The drummer came third, his steps quiet on the wooden floor. He saw the others and smiled, not a performance smile but a real one that reached his eyes. He sat beside the guitarist, their shoulders almost touching. The pianist arrived last. She paused in the doorway, taking in the scene, the soft light, the three figures waiting, the piano standing ready. She did not hurry, she did not apologize for being last. She simply walked in and sat on the bench, her hands resting in her lap. Silence filled the room, not awkward, not heavy, but full. They had not planned this gathering, they had not discussed what would happen. They only knew they needed to be together again. After several minutes the man spoke, his voice soft in the quiet space. "I did not bring equipment," he said. "I did not come to record anything. I only came to listen." The pianist nodded. She turned to the keys and let her fingers hover above them. She did not play immediately. She let the anticipation build, not as tension but as possibility. Then she began. The melody emerged, not identical to the studio version but related like a child to a parent. The same three notes rising, the same gentle fall, the same resolution that felt like coming home. But this time the spaces between notes were wider, more generous. The tempo slower, more patient. The feeling deeper, more lived in. The drummer joined first, not with hands but with breath. He exhaled softly on the third note, creating a cushion of air beneath the sound. Then he tapped one finger on his knee, a heartbeat rhythm, simple, steady, true. The guitarist did not reach for his instrument. He simply hummed a low note that lived beneath the piano melody. His voice was not trained, not perfect, but honest. It carried the weight of weeks spent listening differently to the world. The man sat on an old wooden chair, his eyes closed. He did not direct, he did not judge, he did not produce. He simply received. Tears moved down his cheeks without shame. They were not tears of sadness or even joy. They were tears of recognition, the kind that come when something long buried rises to the surface and says, "I am still here." The melody played through once, then again, each repetition growing more spacious, more trusting. On the third pass the pianist left a longer silence after the second note. 4 seconds of nothing but breath and presence. In that silence something shifted in the room. The air grew thick, not with sound but with connection. The space between them disappeared, not physically but emotionally. They were no longer 4 individuals sharing a room. They were a single organism, breathing together, feeling together, being together. The guitarist finally picked up his instrument. He did not plug it in, he did not seek volume. He let his fingers find chords that lived underneath the melody like roots supporting a tree. Simple shapes, 3 notes at a time, that gave the piano freedom to soar. The drummer moved to a small hand drum he had brought without mentioning. His hands found a rhythm, not on the beat but around it. Sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always listening, always responding. His playing was not performance, it was conversation. The pianist played the melody a 4th time. This time she changed the resolution, not altering the notes but the intention behind them. The final note did not end the phrase, it opened it. Like a door left ajar, an invitation to continue. The man stood slowly and walked to the center of the circle. He did not speak. He simply began to move his body, swaying gently, arms loose at his sides. Not dance, not performance, but embodiment. His body became an instrument translating sound into motion. The others watched not with judgment but with appreciation. They saw his vulnerability, his surrender, his humanity. The music continued, not growing louder or more complex but deeper, more resonant. It was no longer about notes or rhythm or melody. It was about presence. 4 people offering their attention to each other and to the moment. Nothing more, nothing less. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was not empty. It was the richest silence any of them had ever known. Full of what had been shared, full of what had been felt, full of what had been healed without anyone naming the wound. The pianist closed the piano lid gently. The guitarist laid his instrument across his lap. The drummer rested his hands on his knees, palms up. The man stopped moving and stood still, breathing deeply. No one spoke for a long time. Words would have broken the spell, and they knew it. They simply sat together in the afterglow of what had happened. Finally the man opened his eyes and looked at each of them. "Thank you," he said, the words simple but carrying the weight of the evening. "That was not music," he continued. "That was truth." The pianist nodded. She understood what he meant. They had not created art tonight. They had uncovered something that already existed beneath the noise of daily life. A connection, a humanity, a shared heartbeat. The guitarist stood and stretched his arms overhead. He walked to a small kitchen area and filled 4 glasses with water. He handed them around, no ceremony, no toast, just water shared between people who had traveled far to sit together in a simple room. They drank in silence. The water tasted like water, but also like gratitude, like peace, like home. The drummer spoke then, his voice quiet but clear. "I have been teaching children to play drums," he said. "But tonight I remembered why rhythm matters. It is not about keeping time. It is about sharing breath. When we breathe together, we remember we are not alone." The man nodded. "I have spent years treating music as a product," he admitted. "Something to shape and sell and measure. Tonight I remembered it is a language. The language of the heart when words are not enough." The pianist looked at her hands, then at the others. "I came here tonight not knowing what to play," she said. "But my hands knew." They remembered the feeling, not the notes. And that was enough. They sat together for another hour, not playing, not talking much, just being. The city moved outside the windows, cars passing, lives unfolding. But inside the blue-walled room time moved differently. Slower, deeper, more human. When it was time to leave, they did not make plans to meet again. They did not exchange promises or contacts. They simply stood, gathered their things, and walked to the door together. Outside, the night air felt cool against their skin. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not ready to separate. The man looked at the others and smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you," he said again. "For remembering with me." They nodded to each other. No handshakes, no hugs, just quiet acknowledgement. Then they turned and walked in different directions, disappearing into the city lights. But something had changed permanently. They carried the evening with them, not as a memory to revisit but as a new way of being. The melody had done its work. It had not just changed a room weeks ago. It had changed them. And through them it would change other rooms, other people, other moments. The man walked home under street lights, his steps light, his chest open. He knew tomorrow he would return to contracts and deadlines and business calls. But he would carry this evening inside him like a compass. When decisions felt difficult, he would ask not what makes money but what feels true. The guitarist walked to his apartment above the bakery. He found his neighbor sitting on the steps outside. She looked up as he approached. "Come sit," she said. "I have tea." He sat beside her and they drank tea in silence, watching the stars appear one by one. No music played, no words were needed. The space between them held everything. The drummer walked to the river that cut through the city. He sat on a bench and watched water move under moonlight. He placed his hands on his knees and felt the rhythm of his own heart. Steady, patient, alive. He smiled, knowing he would teach his students differently tomorrow. Not technique first but listening first, always listening. The pianist walked through quiet streets to her home. She did not hurry, she did not rush. She noticed things she had missed before. The way light fell through tree branches. The sound of a distant train like a long slow breath. The warmth of her own hands in her pockets. She reached her apartment and sat at her small keyboard. She did not play the melody. She simply rested her fingers on the keys and closed her eyes. The music lived inside her now, not as notes to repeat but as a way of moving through the world. Open, soft, present. The city slept around them. But 4 hearts beat with a new rhythm. A rhythm born from 12 seconds of simple melody. A rhythm that said you are connected. A rhythm that said listen deeply. A rhythm that said this moment matters. And in that rhythm they found what they had not known they were seeking, not fame, not success, not even music itself. But the simple truth that we are here together. And that is enough. The room on the edge of the city sat empty again. But it was not the same empty as before. It held the echo of what had happened. And echoes have a way of growing when tended with care. Somewhere a child would hear a parent humming a simple tune, 3 notes up, 1 down. Somewhere a stranger would pause on a busy street feeling suddenly calm for no reason. Somewhere a heart would open just a little wider because of 12 seconds of honest sound. The melody had left the room. But it had not disappeared. It had multiplied. Spreading through 4 people into the world. Quietly. Gently. Completely. And the world needed exactly that.